cross-border e-commerce segment. My first question is for Kevin in this segment. What impact would the ICS2 Phase 2 rollout have on cross-border e-commerce and trade compliance?
It's a really important question to ask. As somebody that just spent the last 2 years in the cross-border e-commerce world, after spending 15 plus years in more of the traditional trade compliance world, number one, it's interesting to see the differences in approach towards trade compliance and the application of rules and regulations when it comes to traditional, say, containerized freight versus low-value shipments themselves, which is why this question and what happened in March with the Phase 2 rollout that you mentioned in the question is so important. And to be honest with you, I think I don't want to say it's seismic yet in terms of its importance, but I certainly think it's a harbinger of things to come because Lila's already mentioned on the US CBP side, the 321 pilot, the Type 86 pilot. That's for low value shipments coming into the United States, and there's the other component to that conversation is de minimis. Now you're seeing in Europe with IC2S is the part of that rollout was a greater emphasis and greater scrutiny placed on, number one, the description itself, and number two is a much more accurate HS code, at least to the 6, or depending upon the country, to the 10, or the carrier to the 10 or to the full HS number. So that is again, I hesitate to use the word seismic shift yet, but it is a big shift in the e-commerce community where you can no longer now shipping into Europe, and I think eventually around the world, I think the US is next, is shipments now are being scrutinized much more closely by customs regimes than they ever have. And shipments, I mean by low value shipments in this case, so e-commerce shipments, than they ever have before. And you are now running into the potential, and again, I'm monitoring like a lot of people in terms of exactly, how much enforcement the European government regimes or customs regimes in this case place on accuracy of description and HS number. But there is now the very real potential that either the carrier or the customs agency themselves will stop the shipment, which was never the situation prior to the Phase 2 rollout. There was lots of talk about it. There was lots of, we need to do a better job. But again, the enforcement wasn't there. And as we know with trade compliance in particular, if there isn't enforcement, then humans won't change their behavior much. So that's why I'm really curious to see, the longer term impact of Phase 2, not only to shipments into Europe, but to the cross-border e-commerce space in general.
I would just add that the requirement for advanced manifest data is something that we're seeing in all regions in various different countries that has been coming into effect. So we saw this phased in with Egypt over the past couple of years where they started with ocean, they moved to air, and now it's any shipment coming into Egypt is required to have advanced manifest data. Brazil is implementing their own advanced manifest. UAE is working on theirs. For US, we already have that in terms of ISF, and then there's also additional advanced cargo information that's a requirement for air. And so it's something that importers, exporters, carriers, freight forwarders, we should all just be expecting that this is eventually going to be a global requirement for pretty much any country that you ship into, and to be prepared to provide that data. In terms of the Section 321 and the Type 86 pilots, I would add that in conversations that I've had with customs, they're looking to expand the data elements that they're going to require with those types of shipments. And so, these are going to be additional data elements like, the value of the goods in the exporting country's currency. Things like, the more information about the seller, having a website for the e-commerce seller included, having more product details included. And so it's not going to be going in the direction of less data at all. It's going to be more and more data that's required. And it's kind of, it's as a condition. because Section 321 and Type 86 are benefits that you have as far as using these to be able to do low value shipments, and Type 86 in particular being able to do a low value shipment that's even subject to partner government agency requirements. And so in return for being able to do that and to have faster processing, Customs wants all that data.
Following your conversation in relation to the low value shipment, right? Do you think the trade compliance related challenges of cross-border low value shipments will ever result in tighter regulation or greater visibility into what's being shipped? And this question is to you, Lila.
So one of the challenges with trade compliance for e-commerce is one that there's often a misconception that you have to overcome that e-commerce isn't a trade compliance risk because the shipments are of low value, which is absolutely false, because it's something that can actually be very high risk because of the large number of different consignees, because of the availability of almost anyone to place these orders. And so it's very easy for you to have a denied party placing an e-commerce order. It's very easy for someone to try to attempt diversion with this. It's something where people try to skirt the low value rules to get around the $800 limit per day. And so there's a number of different trade compliance challenges to make sure that you're remaining compliant across different regulations with e-commerce. And yet, because of the low value nature, there's this misconception from an operations side that, oh, it's no big deal because it's low value. It's no big deal. But the speed at which it moves also is a challenge to even be able to keep up and make sure that you are catching these risks before the shipment's already been delivered, because things are moving so quickly. I do think that there's visibility to this from a government standpoint. So I haven't heard anything about it this year, but about middle of last year, end of last year, there were definitely some discussions in Congress about some of the Congress people were dissatisfied with the way that Type 86 has been used, because they believe that it has been abused in order to avoid duties for a large number of shipments that otherwise would have been dutiable. And so I think there's an appetite somewhat for at least in the US to re-examine those de minimis rules and what we're doing with 321 and Type 86, and as far as whether that's really accomplishing the goals. But I also think that CBP is doing a lot with showing that they are still maintaining security and oversight for those shipments to try to assuage concerns about it being any type of security risk.
Yeah, and I would just like to add to it again, like as I mentioned, I came out of cross-border world. And again, some of the inherent challenges is, Lila's touched on just the scale alone, right? The billions and billions and billions of low value shipments that occur on a daily basis. So what's going to be interesting to see, and again, I'm like a lot of us, I'm curious to see the partnership, or if there's a partnership between customs agencies and trade, in this case, the e-commerce cross-border world. And what I mean by that is it's one thing for customs to say, thou shalt, but it's another thing to understand the ramifications. So again, in the e-commerce world, everybody wants everything 2 day, same day. So what's going to be interesting to follow is now as you start integrating, say, for example, denied party screening, either at the time, the seller signs up, how do you get, Lila mentioned advanced data. One of the biggest problems and challenges I see right now is, think the Poshmark model where you have yourself or myself want to sell an article of clothing on Poshmark. We're not trade professionals. We don't understand the tariff schedule. We're not going to look up the tariff schedule. We're not going to go to a tool online. So again, I'm going to list a shirt, and that's all the information I have. So the question becomes is, as more and more of these types of regulations bleed into e-commerce and the overall process from the time that listing all the way through, a consumer, a shopper, or buyer lands on a website all the way through checkout, it's going to be interesting to see, and it's going to be a big challenge for these e-commerce players as well as technology providers to figure out, how do we minimize the friction and how do we minimize the disruption? Because the last thing you want to do is, again, require restricted party screening, require, whether or not it's restricted item, for example, and then all of a sudden, it stopped either before you can, before as when you land on the product page on the platform or the marketplace, or at time of checkout, you get a notification that you can't ship this product. So, and that is completely contrary to the overall e-commerce experience. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out and how, again, it's balanced between, the consumer's expectations, the e-commerce model itself, cross-border model, and how customs regimes, work with, within that the confines and the context of, again, cross-border e-commerce.
And I think you made a good point about the classification, because a lot of the goods that are shipping through e-commerce are goods that are very difficult and complex to classify. When you think about clothing, that's a whole specialty within trade compliance, is dealing with textiles. And that is not something that any random trade compliance person has the knowledge of how to go classify, because the rules are so complex in terms of how you classify textiles. There's not just one HS code that says shirt, right? Is it a men's shirt? Is it a women's shirt? Is it a boy's shirt? Is it a girl's shirt? Is it woven? Is it embellished, right? Like there's just so much to that. That's really difficult. And so then even if you have a trade compliance team working on that, that's a lot of work in order to be able to classify those types of items. So I certainly don't envy the teams that have to do that. But I would also add on the denied party screening, this is something where I think a lot of the e-commerce companies are now recognizing that they have a responsibility there under the regulations to make sure that they're doing the screening. But I think that there's still a misunderstanding about where the responsibility lies. And it's that everyone involved in the transaction has a responsibility to do their own screening and make their own determination as far as whether there are any denied parties involved. So this is not something where an importer can't outsource this to their freight forwarder and just say, well, you're going to do the screening for me, right? That it doesn't work that way. The forwarder needs to do their own screening for their own purposes, right? And so then you might be able to outsource a task, but you can never outsource the risk.
So Lila touches on, and I meant to bring it up earlier, but she brings up a very, very important point and question that, in my opinion, is still unanswered today. Is at the end of the day in e-commerce, especially with a cross-border e-commerce move, who is the importer of record?
So I can share a little bit about that. Sometimes the answer is there really isn't one.
Yeah.
So, in a lot of your traditional low value shipments that are moving via parcel carriers, a lot of times the parcel carriers themselves are acting as the importer of record, right? In the way that they're clearing it. Under Type 86, you don't necessarily need an importer of record, but technically the broker is the importer of record. And so Seko is actually one of the largest participants in the Type 86 pilot, and we do a lot of work with Type 86. And technically, we're the importer for the millions of Type 86 shipments that we process regularly, which makes it then very difficult from a risk standpoint, because now I, as the broker, have taken on a lot more risk for compliance with that shipment if I'm technically the importer of record.
Which is what I was going to ask, which is, if you are assuming some or all of that responsibility, then are you assuming the responsibility for an incorrect HS number, for example?
Yes. So the way that we handle Type 86 is when we are onboarding a new customer for a shipper for Type 86, we have a questionnaire that we go through to make sure that they do proper due diligence for the types of products that they'd be offering, and that they're prepared to provide data that we require in order to go through the Type 86 program. So we do a whole customer intake where we do screening. We make sure that they're, a reputable company and things like that. And then we have a process for setting it up so that they're providing us the data we need to do the ACI, the advanced manifest, and to be able to file the Type 86 entry. We also have a lot of checks and balances put in place in the system that we use for Type 86 to ensure that it meets all of the requirements to be a Type 86 entry. And if it doesn't, then we have a way of kicking it out and saying, okay, now this is going to go to just a formal consumption entry instead.
So just to add to that, I mean, do you see that the model going forward is that you and not the marketplace, say an Amazon or an eBay, assume that responsibility? Or they push that responsibility over to you, or attempt to, because again, it's too much for them to manage?
I think it's going to have to be shared. I don't think that there's a way for either party to take on everything. And I think that there's an expectation, there's always been an expectation that a service provider for logistics provides some of that assistance, right? Whether that's just pointing them in the right direction or even providing classification. There are plenty of brokers that do that for their clients. So I think there's always been that expectation, and that has grown where a lot of importers and exporters are really looking to their logistics service providers, whether that's customs brokers or freight forwarders, to be much more of a partner in compliance in terms of helping to make sure that they're on the right track, giving them resources, keeping them up to date as regulations change and things that would apply to them. So I think it's got to be a shared responsibility and a partnership.
Perfect. Thanks, Lila. Thanks, Kevin, for sharing that. My next question is for Kevin. So, Kevin, you've already shed some light on the use of technology, role of technology. But when we further drill this down on an e-commerce world, right? What do you think, or what is your opinion of the role of AI and ML? And in fact, even ChatGPT, what role can it play in today or tomorrow in the world of cross-border e-commerce?
Yeah, just a continuation of what we've already talked about and touched on already. And we've talked about data quality. To be honest with you, the biggest challenge in cross-border e-commerce or e-commerce in general is the description and the quality or lack thereof of the description. Because in many cases, as we talked about, I mentioned the Poshmark model, the eBay model. In many times with these marketplaces, they're just, the information isn't available. Enough information is available for somebody to make a determination as to what is the product. Now it's getting better. For example, you're starting to see more and more the use of, say, product images in conjunction with an AI or machine learning tool, because again, you get a description of shirt. To Lila's previous point, what type of shirt is it? So again, in many cases, again, if it's the seller is not educated or does not have the information, or the marketplace isn't requesting, again, I'll go back to the Poshmark model where, it's requiring you as the seller at the time of your listing to do me a favor and look at the label of the shirt at least to tell me whether or not it's made in China and whether or not it's 60% polyester, 40% cotton, or 100% cotton. And by the way, I'm sure at that point in time whether or not it's a men's, women's, or child's article of clothing. So I think you'll start seeing more of that type of pushback from the marketplaces at listing. But still, until we get to the point where you have more accurate descriptions, as well as potentially combination with the product image, AI, machine learning, and e-commerce world will continue to struggle to come up with even a fairly accurate HS to the 6, let alone to a full HS number. Obviously, there are improvements. Again, I've sold in the past as well. Again, when there's data available, the tools can be trained. The model can be trained to become more and more accurate. But it takes a lot of training and it takes a lot of data, number one, and it takes quality data, number two. So characteristics, attributes, if available, go a long way. And again, training the model. So going forward, once you start using the model, that it is producing more accurate. But again, because of the limitation of the description, you're still only going to get fairly accurate HS numbers because it's still going to be a t-shirt description at the end of the day with a product image. And it's not going to be able to get down to the granular level as to, again, what's its its makeup, whether or not it's 100% cotton or 60% that impacts the HS code. So again, I think and the other key point I'll make too, as we talked about earlier, is the one big benefit of AI machine learning at a minimum is its ability to classify at scale. So again, we talked about the volume of low value shipments. So again, there is no department, there is no individual today that can classify the number of products that a typical marketplace sells, whether or not that's 50,000 or 100,000 or in the millions, depending upon the size of the marketplace. So in that regards, AI machine learning HS tools have a place, is to at least help form or get to somewhat of a baseline that then potentially a human can review, or again, until it's entirely enforced, and again, it's enforced and it's required in terms of advanced data, it might be good enough for now, unfortunately, depending, regarding the HS number that it produces. Not optimal, but again, there still has a long way to go.
So when building manual classification processes, right, within an organization, one of the things that you can do is you can build decision trees for different product lines, right? You can say, okay, well, I classify this type of product all the time, and so then I can build a decision tree so that it goes, okay, between these two chapters, okay, then we're between these headings, and that brings you down to that 10th digit by just answering the different questions that get you there. And so that's the type of logic that you would need to build into AI for classification. But then you need that for all of the different HS codes that exist. And you need to take into account the section notes and the chapter notes and the explanatory notes and customs rulings. And so that's an incredible amount of work that you need to build for all of these different types of product lines. And so then, but I mean, once you've done that, the questions that you need to ask. Kevin, for example, about what's the country of origin, and what's the gender for the shirt, and what's the material made out of. But you have to have all those questions in a succession to be able to get to that right answer, and that assumes that someone even has the right answers to those questions in the first place.
True. Great. Thanks, Lila and Kevin. My next question is for Lila. What are your prediction on directions that custom takes when it comes to the 321 pilot, de minimis, and low value shipments?
So I don't think that the use of Section 321 or Type 86 is going away. From the discussions that I've had with customs and with other trade professionals, I think that they're definitely planning to continue using this. I think that customs does see a benefit because of the increased amount of data that they're receiving in terms of doing this. I do think that there will be changes. One of the things that we're finding as a challenge with Type 86 versus Section 321 is the use of entry numbers. So Type 86 requires an actual entry number. Section 321 entries do not. Well, I think this is something that customs didn't realize then, how many entry numbers were going to end up being used when you did this. Because I can tell you that we and other Type 86 filers are then going through entry numbers by the millions, but in doing this. And I don't think that that's something that customs necessarily realized was going to happen. And it's something that's probably going to need to be addressed as the Type 86 program gets formalized. I do anticipate them adding more data elements to what they're looking to receive for both Section 321 and Type 86 so that they can do better and better targeting and making sure that they're able to catch shipments while they are early in the process and before they're being finally delivered. I'm hopeful that then with that, there's going to be better communication between the local ports and the carriers and service providers. There hasn't always been a willingness on the part of the local port to be very communicative about what's going on with holds and seizures. Sometimes it's really difficult to get information and to be proactive about that. And we actually have requirements on that within customs on the CTPAT side, right? In terms of having more notification about that. So hopefully, this is something where as customs formalizes these programs and moves forward, that the local ports also get a little bit more involved in this in terms of seeing the carriers who are processing Type 86 as partners in compliance and having better lines of communication with them.
So do they touch the $800 de minimis?
So I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that there's rumblings, right? There's people who are dissatisfied with this, but at the same time, I don't think that there's much appetite to really rock the boat when there's so many major businesses that are happy with this. And so I think that there's enough lobbying for keeping it and people that are happy with it that I don't see them touching the de minimis amount. I think that there's too much force behind keeping it the way it is.
And so you may not be close enough to this, but what about foreign trade zones?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's something where I feel like it's been largely ignored in a lot of the trade compliance changes that have been going on. And it's something that ends up being much more local than national anyway, just because of the way that the approval process goes. And so I'm kind of wondering when things are going to circle back around and they're going to take a look at this. But I think that for some of the local places that have lots of FTZs that might have tax shortfalls coming, this is going to be an opportunity that they might look at as far as whether they want to keep providing the same level of tax benefits for FTZs.
Yeah, and part of my question was expanding or allowing an FTZ to act as an e-commerce fulfillment center.
I don't think that CBP is going to want to do that. I mean, I think that it would be helpful if you could just do like weekly entries for e-commerce, because it would cut down entry work. I think that, you know, from a personal selfish standpoint, I think that would be really helpful, but I don't see customs budget on that.
Thanks, Lila. Thanks, Lila, for answering that. Now we are on to the last question of this Fireside Chat, episode 8. And this is for both of you. What do you see on the horizon that the trade compliance community should be monitoring?
So we mentioned advanced manifest. I think that's definitely something that that trade compliance professionals want to pay attention to, is all of the different advanced manifest requirements that are coming in various countries, and the expansion of this, making sure that you have good data, of course. I think you want to understand how the technology landscape for global trade is changing. Definitely staying on top of the new developments that are coming out, new providers that are coming onto the landscape, and understanding if there are solutions that you should be looking at for your organization that maybe didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, because things have changed quite a bit in terms of the software and the technology solutions that are available. Those are definitely things that I would look at. And really just horizon scanning in general in a way that is specific to your organization, really understanding what are the risks that you see and what's coming. So, you know, having subscriptions to a variety of different newsletters in terms of global trade, participating in networking groups, going to conferences and seminars, and also, you know, if you have the opportunity, getting involved in some of the government trade partnership groups too. You know, the CBP has the COAC, they have the Trade Support Network. On the export side, you have DTAG under DDTC. And so there's definitely a lot of opportunity out there to stay up to date and to get involved and make your voice heard about things that are challenges for you as a trade compliance professional.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that. I think, first of all, my opinion is you ain't seen nothing yet. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which side of the equation you're on. And the reason I say that is, you know, if you look at what's in the pipeline globally in terms of, you know, government regimes, customs regimes, and regulatory initiatives, you know, even those that have been enacted and rolled out in 2023, there is a long list trailing right behind what's already out, first and foremost. So it's only going to get more complex and more challenging. And one of the reasons is because, you know, protectionism, whether or not you agree with it or not, is here to stay. Companies are now looking, you know, more inward and, you know, either a country level or regional level wise to protect their own interest. You now have, again, with the, you know, coming out of the pandemic, you have people reevaluating supply chains and their supply chain network designs. So I think, you know, the ESG, sustainability, forced labor, it only continues, as well as, you know, what is coming behind that, that is either layered on top of those initiatives or new initiatives that either are completely new, that are areas that we haven't talked about yet, or are an expansion of what's already in place. And again, that goes back to just the added complexity that continues, because now it's no longer simply, do I manage free trade agreements between 5 or 6 different countries where the U.S. has free trade agreements, for example. It's now, I've got to keep tabs on every market, because every government regime is rolling out their own initiatives that either A, are somewhat complementary at times, or B, conflict. either with other rules and regulations from other government agencies around the world that are on the books, or even with their own, governments being governments. So I think that unfortunately this crazy train is not going to stop anytime soon for the trade compliance professional. The other thing that's interesting too is we talked about a lot of them mentioned country of origin. I think you're starting to see too, in my opinion, a little bit of what's old is new again, because it goes back to, we talked about, and country of origin has been out there forever. But again, as we move into especially the Gen Z and sustainability, as country of origin becomes more and more important. If you look at some of the recent legislation, for example, the Inflation Act and EVs in particular, and where they're sourced and how you qualify for a tax credit, that's going to become a bigger challenge as well in terms, and as the trade compliance knows, country of origin determination is no easy task. So that's just one more thing that I think is going to become more and more important and yet more and more challenging for them to manage. And then what I find interesting too is I've started to see, again, because of electric EV and sustainability efforts and ESG, conflict minerals is becoming mentioned again and in the news more than it has been in the last, 5 to 10 years, as well as, say, Lacey Act, right? So it's just one thing after another. And to my last point, it's regulatory requirements that have been on the books for a while, but we really haven't paid much attention to, that are now starting to come to the forefront, which is just in addition to everything else we've been talking about and all the new initiatives that have been recently rolled out, during COVID or post-pandemic.
So I just wanted to add on the ESG in terms of whether it's forced labor or conflict minerals or other types of things like that fall into the ESG realm. One of the other things that we're seeing is a lot more involvement by NGOs in making public information about what companies are doing with respect to that. So there are a number of companies that have been publicly called out for using forced labor that aren't already subject to withhold release orders or investigations from customs, but private organizations, non-governmental organizations that have been able to dig through the data and find data that supports the accusation that they're using forced labor, or that they're using conflict minerals or things like that, or that they're skirting the Russian regulations, the Russian sanctions. And so there's going to continue to be more involvement of NGOs of publicly calling out companies that are not fulfilling their ESG obligations.
Thanks, Lila. Thanks, Kevin. Thank you both for some great insights. And with that, we come to an end of this fireside chat.